Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode and the third episode of Euros Group Talk, where today we'll be breaking down Group D. In this four-episode special series leading up to the Euros, I'll be joined by a special guest to talk about one of the groups to really take a deep dive to all of the four teams in that group and how they will perform. Joining me today to break down Group D, a very tough and dramatic group that includes England, the reigning champions, the Netherlands, the former champions, France, as well as Wales. It's none other than Rich Laverty. Rich, it's a pleasure to have you here with me one more time, and we're going to talk about the big dogs, the reigning champions, Group D. First of all, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm very excited to talk about Group D, like I've just said. And usually it's been coined group drama, and when you actually look at the teams in here, I think we're going to see a little bit of drama. They obviously have the reigning champions of the Lionesses, England, Netherlands, France, and making their debut in the Euros, Wales. Let's talk first about England and sort of the Lionesses, who have had quite a narrative around them going into this tournament before the official squad was announced. We've seen some senior players dropping out of the contention almost 5 weeks out before the Euro, so quite a tight timeline when it came to sort of putting the team together. How do you assess that veteran loss, so it's been coined, of this team? We know, they're quite major players who were very, very involved in last Euros. How do you look at it when you see some of these names not included this time round?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting period. Like you say, you don't usually see players retire, before a tournament. I don't know. I think things naturally these days get a little bit overblown. I never think it's quite as dramatic as probably it seems, and probably these
Yeah.
things will maybe more known within the camp than, they were publicly. I think even with Mary, Bran, Millie, like there's still a lot of experience, when you look at Lucy Bronze and Alex Greenwood and people like that. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but even people now like feels like they're still youngsters really in terms of, time flies, but Beth Mead's now 30 and Kira Walsh is 28, Leah Williamson's 28, they're now experienced players, even though it feels like 2 minutes ago since they broke onto the scene with England. Yeah, I mean, I think they're all different. I think Fran, was told she wasn't going to be in the squad anyway. So, whatever people think about that, that's Serena's decision. And it's understandable. I think when you look at, the players England have got around that number 10 position on the pitch, Ella Toone, Jess Park, Grace
Mm.
Clinton, Lauren James being fit, I get that. I think Mary, at the end of the day, it's tough, She's been used to being the number one, and the goalkeeper position is if you're on the bench, you're not going to
Hmm.
come on, unless someone gets injured. If you're a striker, obviously, and you're on the bench, you're probably going to come on most games. We saw that at the last Euros with Toon, with Russo, with Kelly. They were the impacts of every single game. The number two goalkeeper is not going to come on. So if that's not for Mary, and she thinks she's not going to be in the right headspace, in terms of maybe offering that support, then
Hmm.
maybe it's better that she does step away. England have still got a strong goalkeeping department. I think Millie, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. Like, I don't want to, go in on it. She said she's stepping away for her physical and mental health, and you've got to respect that. So again, fortunate, got Leah Williamson, got Alex Greenwood, who hopefully we'll see at centre back now. She didn't really get that chance so much at the last tournament.
Hmm.
And good young players too. Lotta, Esme Morgan, Jess Carter been playing there. So yeah, I mean, Millie certainly is not ideal, in terms of someone you probably would have looked at and gone, she's probably going to start, but
Yeah.
it is what it is. It's you get injuries or you get illnesses, you get people pull out. It's no different to any other tournament where, like the last tournament, losing people like Leah Williamson in the build up, with injuries, it's
Hmm.
just got to compensate for it with the depth. I'm sure it's not been ideal, but
Hmm.
I think England have got fortunately enough strength and depth that they should be able to cope with it in terms of, at least getting through the group stage and ticking that box.
Yeah. I think for any coach, when they look at their players, they probably want their players to be 100% in. And if a player is expressing that they can't be 100% in, it's best that they're not in, and they're not in just to have sort of themselves make that squad. And so I think there's some respect to put on some of these players that, yes, they've probably had to make decisions very close to time, but you'd rather have Mary or Snobby included, knowing that she can give 100% in. Likewise with Millie Bright. And I want to talk a little bit about the results that we've seen with the Nations League. They've had players sort of in and out in terms of injuries. Lauren James, sort of Lauren Hemp, and that group of players that now we see are in the squad. How do you assess the last 12 months in terms of they've had strong wins over Portugal recently, and they've had a narrow defeat by Spain? It's I don't want to say a bag of mixed results. They've been relatively positive more than not in the last 12 months.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to go back very quickly to what you said there. I completely agree. Like, we're not in a position to be in anybody else's headspace. So, players don't want to be there for whatever reason. Like, I think we all fully respect that. Yeah, in terms of results, it's been a very, I don't know what the right word is. It's been a very dysfunctional 12
Mm,
months. There's been some good performances. There's been some bright moments, and then there's been some, real disappointments. Probably that all the Nations League games really. You go back to February and those two games, and you draw with Portugal, and you think, that's a little bit disappointing. And then you go and beat Spain in the next game, and you think, okay, we're back on the right tracks. And then it was the same in April. Absolutely dismantled Belgium. Have had some really good results this year with a new head coach, and you think again, this looks really good. And then 4 days later,
mm,
they were a bit of a shambles over in
yeah,
Belgium. 3-0 down after half an hour, and you're going like, how is this the same team that played 4 days ago? I thought the last camp was okay. I mean Portugal were very erratic, and obviously they lost to Spain, and it was probably a deserved loss, but they were competitive. It wasn't a embarrassing, defeat. It wasn't 4
yeah,
5-0 or something like that. It was a good game. So yeah, I think they're hard to judge. I mean, like you say, there's been some injuries. They haven't had Lauren Hemp for a big chunk of the season. Didn't have Georgia Stanway for a big chunk of the season. Lauren James, people like that. So I still always look at England's attack and the
mm,
players that could score goals, whether that's Russo, whether it's Toon, whether it's Clinton, Mead, Hemp, Kelly, Viva Jones, and Chloe Kelly's come into, great form since she went to Arsenal in January. And, on their day, England are capable of, blowing anybody away. I think maybe still that concern down the other end. It's just not quite looked as sort of set as it did a few years ago. I don't think England, I mean, I wouldn't make them favourites going into the tournament. I think they'll do okay. I think they'll get through the group. And
yeah,
then after that, you've got to see what you draw in terms of whether you come first or second. Like you say,
mm,
I mean, in a 16-team tournament, you're always going to have four really competitive groups. I think it probably is the toughest,
yeah,
in terms of obviously you've got the other European champions from before, the Netherlands, France are looking really strong, and yeah, Wales are new, but that can be dangerous. So they're going to have to be at their best, and sometimes that's when England do sort of come good, and they really
mm,
have to be on it. So yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting tournament for them. I think it's hard to really read where they're at the moment.
mm. Do you think it's a matter of consistency that they've not gotten right, or is it an issue of, I'm gonna say, defensive liabilities that they haven't fully addressed because they've been leakier than what we're used to?
Yeah, they have, and like I said, there has been some chopping and changing. Obviously with Mary going out as the goalkeeper and sort of slowly phasing in Hannah Hampton as the number one. There's been changes at the back, like you say, with Millie sort of being in and out through injuries and then coming back and now stepping away. They haven't probably found the formula. I mean, still, we've been talking
Mm,
about England's left back position for years and years, and obviously it was Rachel Daly at the Euros, and then we sort of saw that wing back formation at the World Cup, and now it's kind of been Neve Charles. I thought she struggled in the Spain game. I really like Neve Charles, but I think that's still a question mark area for England. There's still a lack of depth in midfield. We've talked about it. If something happens to to Kira Walsh, which we saw at the last tournament.
Hmm.
There isn't a lot in there. There's only five midfielders in the squad, and really Kira is the only defensive option. And even with Kira, she's a defensive midfielder, but she's very attacking in how she plays. She's not the breaking up play and flying into tackles and things like that. Like a I don't know, a Juliet, kind
Yeah.
of defensive midfielder. She's on the ball. So I think England can be very open in transition, and yeah, maybe that defense isn't quite where it was a few years ago, but
Mm.
you're right. I think all the defenders have had moments, where you're looking at them going, they've had unbelievable games, and then, I mean, there's games I've watched Leah Williamson play for England recently, and I'm a bit like, I mean,
Mm.
you watch her in the Champions League final, and probably one of the best games I've watched Leah Williamson ever have,
Yep.
against Barcelona in the Champions League final. It's really incredible. So, if you get that kind of level, then, you're going to be onto something good. But I just think, yeah, there's just a few too many unknowns. I think, like you say, inconsistency is probably the right word. I think all those players, England have genuine world-class players in every position. It's just seeing it on a regular basis at the moment.
Yeah. I think if Serena is able to put in that mentality of having a good day at the office every time they're on the pitch, which is a tough ask at times, and sort of making sure there's no injuries happening in the midfield, I think that'll raise the chances of England. Otherwise, I think it might look a little up and down for them. Not necessarily in the groups, but perhaps past. But let's talk about the group because they do have a tough group of France and Netherlands and Wales. And I want to talk about France a little bit here because had they been in another group, I think they would be also coined as favorites. In fact, France, any tournament they head into, they're coined as one of the bigger favorites, but they have, I'm going to call it some sort of like major tournament syndrome when they're not able to push to that final push that I think you would assume when you're looking at their squad on paper. New head coach that they're working here with, I don't want to say questionable call ups, but certainly some players that were not involved in the squad, including Wendy Renard. Is it the right decision? Is it a matter of this is a new era, we're starting a new era with the call ups as well? Or is it something that might come and bite him back and, might bite him back?
Yeah, I mean, it could. I'm so fascinated by France in this tournament. I mean, we are every tournament because, like you said, they always get lauded as sort of one of the favourites. They're going to be there, and then they have the implosion, and something goes wrong, or people fall out, or someone drops out of the squad. There's always something that seems to go wrong where France are concerned. But yeah, I mean, like you say, he's made some big decisions in terms of leaving out Wendy Renard, probably the biggest one. The Sommer, I mean, they've got a lot of depth in that forward area. I feel like with where the Sommer's at in her career, it's a little bit more understandable.
Mm-hmm.
Kenza Dali was a little bit of a surprise. She's been quite a constant in there. And again, they don't have a huge amount of like midfield depth. I think there's technically four midfielders in the squad, which is even less than England. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those, isn't it? And listen, again, I respect every manager's decision. At the end of the day, they can pick whoever they want. And you live and die by those decisions. And I mean, it's kind of working at the moment. And I'm so reticent to always sort of talk France up going into a tournament, but I think they are by far and away the most informed team. I mean, they've
Yep.
played seven games, this year, and six of them are Nations League games. And Nations League games are not easy because you're playing teams at your level. That was the whole point of bringing it in. So, they've been playing Norway, Iceland, Switzerland. Okay, maybe that's not as tough a group as they're going to have at the Euros. They absolutely, battered Belgium. The other night, they've got Brazil in a couple of days, which will be interesting to see.
Yeah.
Brazil probably one of the tougher tests that they've had. But again, you talk about leaving out Renard. I mean, they've played seven games this year and they've kept six clean sheets.
Yeah.
So you're kind of sort of looking at it going, well, being justified, a little bit at the moment in terms of the decisions.
Yeah.
And it's a tough opening game for England. So at the minute, I think you'd make France the favourites for that group. I still don't think you'd make them favourites for the tournament. While Spain are in it, I think they're going to be probably the favourites. But something is working with France at the moment. But like you say, I mean, it has to click one day. When you look at the team, you look at Diani and Katoto and Cascarino and Baltimore, Gayoro, Toletti, like there's so much talent in there. I mean, even Melvin Mallard, she's not been a regular starter. She scores a hat trick the other night. Baltimore's had a incredible first season at Chelsea, probably been better than maybe anyone here potentially gave her credit for before she came over.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean they're looking good, but like you say, it's just there's always that little question mark, isn't there? Of are
Yeah.
they going to do a France? Are they going to implode? Is something going to happen? But I kind of don't mind it. Listen, if you're going to make big decisions, make them before the tournament, get it out of the way,
Yeah.
and that's it. Everyone knows where they stand, and they can prepare rather than it being dragged into the tournament and then maybe Renard being in the squad and then her being dropped or being on the bench, and it becomes a big story. So
Yeah.
I sort of said that with England the other week as well. If Mary Earps was still there and she's on the bench and people are asking questions and now it's nipped in the bud, it's done, whatever people think, and you can concentrate on the tournament. So I feel like that's a little bit where it's like with France. They've made that big decision, they've drawn a line in the sand and that's it. They know where they stand. So yeah, they're playing well. They're picking up good results, and I think yeah, that first game next week between France and England is going to be a pretty interesting one.
Yeah, I think it's there's not much more of a deeper conversation you can have about France because we can sit here all day and talk about how, good the team is. They've got some talented players that are coming in form. But then, France very similar to Norway almost, where on paper they've got so many stars, but they just aren't able to hit the level that we know they are able to hit. But likewise, I think I'd agree with the fact that take those hard decisions beforehand rather than have a narrative stirred during the competition. And with that opening game, France and England, like, is a nervy England backline going to be able to handle perhaps a, laser focused front line of France? And I think that's going to be a fun one to watch. Let's talk about the Dutch a little bit. Another tournament with Andries Jonker, a final week of their group. A little bit disappointing. They had a heavy defeat by Germany, a draw to an out of form or perhaps a struggling Scotland is far from the best preparation that they were hoping for. Again, is it a matter of injuries that the Netherlands have? I think for me, it's injuries in a very similar story of England is just not being consistent and they haven't found the right puzzle to get Netherlands firing game after game against tough opposition.
Yeah, I feel like with Netherlands, maybe there's an element to it, and not to sound disrespectful, but it's quite a small nation. I think they have quite a small pool, and they don't have the strongest domestic league. And I just think, like, obviously they won it in 2017 and then got to the World Cup final, and that kind of propelled them into the mindsets of people sort of expecting them to be at the back end of major tournaments. Whereas I don't think Netherlands were going to be able to sustain that. I think it was going to be tough, and I think you're sort of seeing them now where you'd expect. They've got some very good players, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they're quite that top tier. Listen, they've still had some good results, and again, a little bit like England,
Yeah.
it's a little bit puzzling. You see them have a good draw against Germany at the start of the year, and then, like you say, in the reverse fixture, at the end of last month, they got absolutely battered, and then yeah, I mean, a disappointing draw against Scotland, and I mean, I mean, again, they've got another game in a couple of days, so we'll see where they're at. But yeah, in terms of that player pool, I'm not seeing there's a lack of sort of freshness a little bit.
Mm.
I mean, you look back at the squad that won the Euros. I mean, it's 8 years ago now, but there's a lot of players. You've got Sharida Spitzer, 35. Van der Donk 30. Sorry, Van der Donk 33, Groningen 30. You know, Renate Janssen still in there, 34. It's almost like getting a few youngsters through, but maybe not as many coming through as they'd want. I think there is still that element of are they producing the next Miedemars, the next Van der Donks, the next, there's some in there, don't get me wrong, the
Mm.
ones that Chelsea have signed, Vila Berman, like the captain, really good players. Esme Boots obviously at Barcelona, but yeah, I feel like maybe those two tournaments kind of heightened everyone's expectations. I think they're a good team and I think they'll
Mm-hmm.
be competitive, but I think there's almost that little switch been flipped in people's minds if they expect to see the Dutch at semi-finals and finals because it's kind of what we got used to for a few years. I think they'll be really competitive. I don't think it's going to be an easy game for anyone, but I just feel like they're struggling now to, apart from a few, and I'm not saying there's no players at all coming through. There clearly is. And I mentioned the Chelsea girls. There's the goalkeeper too that Chelsea have just signed. She's not in the squad, but yeah, I just
Yeah.
feel. maybe they're just lacking a little bit of, freshness in the team. I think you look through that midfield, people like
Mm,
Spitzer, Van Donk, Groningen, Road, Pullover, Demar, they've been in there for a while now.
yep,
So I think they'll do fine. Like you say, they have had injuries. Miedemar's been struggling most of the season. She makes a massive difference, obviously to any team. So we'll see. But
yep,
I'd be putting probably France and England above them at the moment. But yeah, I mean that says it all about the group, isn't it?
yeah,
One of the really big nations is going to fall early on.
yeah.
Anything can happen in a one-off game, but I don't know. I don't know about the Dutch. I'll be interested, but I just
Hmm.
feel like maybe they're just lacking that little bit of,
Yep.
exciting young players coming into the squad, particularly in the attack. That's where you look, isn't it, for sort of the fresh legs that are gonna come on and change things. Like you say, you've got Esme Boots, but yeah, I'll be interested to see how
Yeah.
it goes. But I think um, I think France and England would be disappointed if they were below them at the minute.
Yeah, I think with Netherlands, and when you compare their time of success, it's a golden generation that stands out. It's a group of superstars that were in their prime almost. Miedema at the time of the Euros was quite young, but she was hitting her strides, and very similar to Van de Donk and some of the names that you mentioned. And when you look at that player pool, there's not as much competition of youngsters pushing out these older players, which maybe is a cause of concern, assessing their own home professional league, and that's a completely different conversation. But I think for the Netherlands, I would echo what you're mentioning of they're just struggling to get that established, fresher group, and not to mention some of the big Chelsea great names that you've mentioned. Wales in here, I think, is a fun team. First major tournament. I think Rian Wilkinson has done a fantastic job getting the team at this point and getting the nation behind them. it, you know, looking at some of their recent performances, it was a decisive defeat by Italy, so close but just not there. And they haven't been able to register a win in League A with the Nations League. Despite that, we've seen a much more improved Wales than perhaps a year and a half ago. This is a big step for a nation not so big and one like Wales.
Yeah, I mean, I think their results probably shadow maybe what we would expect at the Euros. Like they've been competitive, but they've just fallen a little bit short. Like you say, they've not been, beaten badly in any game until that Italy match. And I hope that doesn't set them back too much. Italy are doing quite well at the minute. I think they'll
Hmm.
be actually quite daft horses to do well in this tournament. But yeah, you look at the results they've had, two 1-0 losses, a 2-1 loss, and a couple of 1-1s. So they've been really close. They just, are just a little bit short. And I think that's what they'll be in this group. I don't think it'll be, 4-5-6-0, things like that. I think it'll be, 1-2-0 or 2-1 or something like that. They're set up very well. I think Rhian Wilkinson's a good coach. I think she's done a really, really good job. But I do think they lack
Mm.
just a little bit in the attack. They always have. It's always been a sort of struggle. I mean, the top scorer in the squad in terms of the forwards is Kayleigh Barton, but she's 37. She's been there a long, long time. The rest of the strikers, Theo Morgan's got 2 goals. I think Carrie Jones, Elise Hughes, Hannah Kane have got 2 or 3 goals each as well. So, they're not a team that's going to score, tons of goals. So they're going to have to be
Hmm.
defensively solid. Yeah, listen, great for them, and
Yeah,
hopefully they develop off the back of this tournament. And
yeah.
it's been long overdue. I'm really pleased with them. Know a lot of the players. Come across a lot of them over the years, and you know, it's great for Wales, great for the nation. I think there's going to be realistic expectations of where they're at, but let's see. I'm sure they'll be up for it, and I'm sure they'll fight for their lives with every game.
Mhm. I think they'll be aware that they do lack a clear goal scorer. There's only so many times Jess Fishlock can step up and score, that final goal to get the team across the line. But for a debuting team like Wales, if they have the first goal or the first loss or the first draw, first win, whatever it may be, it's going to be a historic sort of moment to learn from and improve and look for a future tournament. If you're Wales, what is something that you're looking to get out of a tournament like this, and what is a lesson that can set you on a good track? for future improvement?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be a springboard. It can't be a one-off. It can't be a we've been at the Euros and that they've got to try and get to the World Cup in 2027, or at least establish themselves as a regular in the European tournaments. It has to be a springboard, I think, to get more girls playing football in Wales. There's some really good players in the Wales squad. There's quite a few, that have come over as sort of a secondary nation, that have been born in England, playing in England, that maybe have, Welsh ancestry. And, that's a great thing for them to be able to rely on because they've got some good players through that. But, you look at those key players that we've talked about over the years, people like Jess Fishlock, like you say, and, Sophie Ingle, Angrid James, Hayley Ladd, they're all into their 30s now. They're not going to be around forever. So it's a little bit like we said with the Dutch, it's a small country. So, can they bring those young players through? Can this be an inspiration for young girls in Wales to say, I want to play football?
Mm,
Because they're going to need them. Jess Fishlock not around forever. She's 38. Um, Hayley, Sophie, Angrid, people like that, they're not going to be around for that much longer. Kaylee Barton, like I said, is 37. So yeah, it has to be a springboard to get more people involved because they're going to lose probably their key names in the next couple of years. Um, so yeah, I think that's the biggest legacy for me. Listen, no one's expecting Wales to go out and win this tournament or
no.
probably even get out of the group, but it has to make a change in that country to get more people involved because if more young girls start playing football and see Wales at a major tournament, that's going to create a pathway because they need to start getting young players through, whether it's their own or, like you say, players in England that maybe have Welsh family and qualify that way. Because if they don't, this will end up being a one-off and they've worked too hard for that. So yeah, I think that has to be the biggest thing. It has to create a point where more young girls are playing football in Wales to make sure there's players coming through, when the likes of Jess and Sophie and Haley, etc., retire.
Hmm. I think it's going to be the last dance of that group, which is, tough one to admit. Their first dance in the Euros, but their last as a group. And I think it's important that sort of they have a tournament that starts the passing on of the torch, sort of for the grassroots, for the, youth teams in that nation. Nobody likes giving predictions, but people do love listening to predictions. And I feel like you've kind of hinted at who you think is gonna get out of the group. But how do you say this one ranking in the standings once every match day of the group stage is already concluded?
Yeah, I mean it is hard, You talk about form, and I sort of always feel like it does go a little bit out the window when you get to these major tournaments. I know it's a bit cliched, but
Yeah.
you look at the form, and I mean, France are flying. They really are winning games, scoring goals. They're not conceding. They've got some top class players. I don't think England have quite found that correlation.
Mhm.
But yeah, you put me on the spot. I'd probably have to say France win the group.
Yeah.
I think England would be disappointed if they're not at least second. It'll be a nervy game. If they do lose that first game against France, then it puts a lot of pressure on the game against the Netherlands. Certainly because that might decide who goes through in second. So you've got to be wary. For all I've said about the Dutch, they've got some top class players. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'll go France and England. I think France will win the group and England get through in second. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely a hard group to predict because you've got certainly three teams in there that have got really almost unlimited experience at this level, and then obviously the newcomers that will be trying to spoil the party. But yeah, I'll go France and England.
Yeah. No devil's advocate comment for me. I think yeah, I'm really looking forward to that first game of England and France because I think it's gonna set the tone for how the rest of the group might play out. Rich, you're going to be covering plenty of this. You've already covered and continue to cover a lot of the players that are involved in the Euros across different nations and different squads. What sort of coverage are you going to be doing this Euros and where can people read all of it?
Yeah, same as ever. So I'll be on my Substack, doing my usual profiles, features, interviews, sort of away from the news and the match reports. There will be some takes and analysis on the games and each day. But yeah, I'm doing quite a few other bits at the minute as well around different magazines and newspapers. So possibly got something. It's so interchangeable at the minute in terms of where
Hmm.
things go and who wants what. So yeah, pretty. It's an exciting time because there's a lot more outlets now covering women's football, and it always goes a little bit up that way when there's a major tournament. People start showing a bit more interest. But yeah, across my Substack, there'll be stuff going out from the end of this week all through the tournament. So yeah, looking forward to it. I think it'll be a good tournament. Like when there is only 16 teams, like it's so competitive. But yeah, always ends a little bit quicker than you'd want when there's only 16 teams. Like before you
Hmm.
know it, you're into the quarterfinals. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think it'll be a very good tournament, and yeah, I think it's hard to predict a winner at this point, which is great because
Yeah.
it just shows how much quality there is across Europe right now.
I'll leave all of Rich's stuff down below. I do recommend you go and definitely subscribe to Substack with any matter that you could. It could be a free subscription. Do it. There's so many unique stories there, and highlights and features of a lot of players that you might still be getting introduced to and getting to know across the Euros. Rich, thanks for joining me to talk about Group D here. And I think let's hope it plays out the way we predicted it. But women's football can have some dramatic and different storylines than we predict. So we'll stay tuned to see how that goes.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on, and yeah, hopefully, like I said, it's a great tournament for everyone to enjoy.